Just one more story, Alan. You mentioned in the book the 5 best bookmakers that you had come across. You want to tell us a bit about them?
Yeah, I mean, I love talking about the 5 best bookmakers. The 5 best bookmakers I ever came across, and you've got to remember, this is my opinion. They're all dog bookmakers. When I say dog bookmakers, greyhound bookmakers, and they're all from the south. So, you know, I never bet up north, so I'm sure there's just as good, and you've all got your own opinions, but this is my opinion of the bookmakers. The guy, to my mind, who was the best bookmaker was a guy called Georgie Knight, known as the Legend. Georgie Knight I met when I was 16 at Hackney Wick. He was probably getting on for about 30. He was a big guy, 6'2", and probably weighed 18 stone. Never ever without a smile on his face. The reason why I give him as the best bookmaker, he could go to any dog track in the world with £10 in his pocket and make a book. You know, he didn't have to go with unlimited money. Somehow he could control his book with £10. The other part about George was that he could go to a track which looks basically deserted, and from nowhere, if there was 10 punters in the track, they would find George. And he had this sort of list of clientele of the best and the worst, and I can assure you some of these people used to bet with George were the worst. But the story I remember most of all about George was he was betting at Clapton dog track with a guy named Bernie Dorris, who had a snooker card club in Stoke Newington, just down the road from the dog track. In those days there were 8 races. Yeah, 8 races. Can anybody think about it? 8 races, 2 meetings a week. No, I don't think anybody remembers that. It came to the last race. George was winning £2,000. You could buy probably at least 3 houses for that in those days. He stood the last favourite for £2,300, and the favourite won. Him and Bernie Dorris parted company that night. But I believe after that, George was running a dice game on the snooker table in Bernie Dorris's club. He was my #1 bookmaker. Number 2 was Tony Morris, known as the Professional. Tony Morris, again, he would go to a track, and there was so many people who wanted to bet with Tony Morris. I think he used to get a bus, a double-decker bus, and bring them with. There were so many people. He was a true professional and knew his percentages and was a great, great bookmaker. But George, because of the way he controlled his money, was probably still the best. The only problem with George was, though, that if he finished up with £200 in his pocket that night, he had to go and gamble somewhere else. He'd go to play cards, whatever it was, dice, knowing that the odds were against him, and still play. And I find that hard to believe a man with his knowledge of percentages should play games where he knows that he's going to lose. My 3rd bookmaker was a guy called John Power, or John Jenkins, which is his real name. He and his brother Tom used to bet at Walthamstow. I know John as the Viking. He had long blonde hair down on his shoulders like the Viking soldiers. John's memory, or one of the memories I can remember about John, was when he was betting at Walthamstow. The other bookmakers there hated him because he was so far in advance of the other bookmakers. He would change the odds every second, and the bookmakers were finding it harder and harder to keep up with him. And at one race, I remember, John started to change the prices of the dogs, the whole 6 dogs. And all the bookmakers did their best to follow him. And as they followed him, John changed the prices again. And all the bookmakers followed him again. What did John do? He did it again. And all the bookmakers followed him again. But by this time, John had put up a percentage that basically, if a punter wanted to back the dogs, he could back the 6 dogs and show a 3% profit. Doesn't matter what won. And John jumped off the stall and run down to the other 4 bookmakers and said, I want to back every dog to win £1,000, every dog to win £1,000, meaning that whichever dog won, John would have won £30. None of the bookmakers bet him though. The other guy, not being one of my favourite personalities, but is a guy called Roger Kent Barton. I will say Roger is one of the pluckiest bookmakers, especially in the game today, that if you are a punter, he will give you a bet. He doesn't understand the percentages like the other bookmakers at all. He's not a very nice man to bet with, because if you back 2 or 3 winners, he tells you that F off. If you don't have a bet with him for 2 races, he comes and puts his arm around you and says, why don't you bet with me? But he is very, very game. He always, every race he loses on, he rucks the bookmaker, the clerk or the floorman, everybody's fault that he lost on the race. And he had one particular punter though, known as Robert the Pole. And Robert the Pole, didn't have to see him, but you knew he was in the track, because after 2 races, all you would find was Scottish money floating about. Robert the Pole was an importer of cigarettes. I don't think they were legitimate somehow. But Robert the Pole came to Romford every meeting and he would bet with Roger. And it was great to see him stand on the stand and he'd say to Roger, £2,000, trap 4. And Roger would say, what trap? And trap 4. And we found out he wanted £2,000 on trap 2. And this went on for months and months and months, or even years. And this guy used to pay, and it was great to see him have his bets. One night he was doing £14,000 to Roger, and it came to the last race, and he shouted down, Roger, £2,000, trap 3. And Roger bet him. The price of the dog was 14 to 1. So Roger actually laid him at 28,000 to 2. The dog won. That was the first time I've ever seen Roger couldn't actually speak. He couldn't even have a go at his bookman. It was his own fault. The last bookmaker was a guy called Phil Earle at White City. He used to get on the stand at White City and for the 8 races wouldn't get off. One of the reasons was he had a wooden leg. So he'd stand there all night long with his wooden leg. But he was a bookmaker when gambling was in its glorious, glorious days, after the war in the 50s and 60s. And I talk about money. You know, I said that the bookmakers at the track on Romford on Monday took £360 approximately between the 3 of them. In those days that I'm talking about, when there was 8 races at White City, I would imagine they were taking £5,000 a race. But he used to stand there like a rock. Couldn't have a joke with him or his firm because it was a business. But the one thing I will say, whether I used to win or lose, because I was placing bets, I was only 15, 16 at the time, I was placing bets for punters. At the end of the night, I used to get my £2 off of him, win, lose or draw. That's why I was a bloody good bookmaker.
Alan, I do understand that you're enjoying your retirement, still in the game these days. Can you tell us a bit about your adventures?
Well, my current adventures are that I have a very, very old friend of approximately 55 years now, who actually had a share with me when I was making a book at Wembley, who, when I published the book, he came to the day we published it, and he asked me what I'm going to be doing with myself. And I said, well, you know, again, my favourite saying, a bit of this and a bit of that. So he said, why don't you come horse racing with me? Well, I thought to myself, you know, to be asked to go horse racing with this guy is quite amazing, because he is one of the biggest owners of the world, in the world, with his partners. The guy is called Michael Tabor. He's got partners Derek Smith and Magnia, John Magnia, and their trainer Aidan O'Brien's one of the nicest men I've ever met in my life. and I thought, shall I go racing? Well, I can tell you, I can't wait basically every day to go racing now. The people I have met and the people I meet is quite unbelievable. You know, I have gone from a world where, you know, I've known people who have been quite affluent, but I've gone to people that I can't quite understand what money is. I'd just like to say that one of the highlights of going racing was we were in California last year for the Breeders' Cup, and we were in a box when a guy walked in, and I looked at this guy and I thought, I know you, but where would I know you from? You know, I'm in America, and I think, where would I know him from? And I looked, and he was quite an old man, and I thought, I must have met him racing in England. Michael introduced me to him, and we sat down, him and his wife, and we sat down and we had a very nice lunch. And he turned around to me and he said, what are you doing tonight, Alan? And I said, oh, well, I'm with Michael. He said, no, Michael will come with. He said, I want to take you out for dinner. And he took us out for dinner. And to say it was one of the highlights of my life, it really was, because although I wasn't quite sure who he was until I was introduced to him, he was one of my heroes in the music business. The guy's name was Burt Bacharach, you know, and he's coming to London July the 5th and 6th. Don't get on quick, get your tickets.
Now, it sounds to me like your stories are still happening on a day-to-day basis. So are there any plans for another book?
Yes, I've written probably half a book is what I would like to say. Again, all the money will go to the hospice. That's the only reason I'm doing it. I just want to keep, you know, as long as I can, I want to try and find out ways of giving them, you know, what they deserve, because it, you know, until my wife was ill, I'd never been in a hospice in my life. And I cannot tell you the feeling that they gave everybody and the help. And I just, even today, even talking about it makes me like become a bit overwhelmed sort of thing. So I thought, okay, I'll come up with some more stories, which I had done. I've also come up with the idea that I should get stories from other people in the racing business who might be able to tell me a story that they think would be enjoyable to the public. You know, I've got people like Graham Sharp, John Coleman, Steve Fluin. These are all people in the racing game, Jonathan Hobbs, and a few others. And they come up with some great stories, and I'm putting that into the book. And hopefully, by the end of May, we'll probably be in a position to start trying to get it published. And hopefully from then on, we can get another chapter 2, if you want to call it that, going. And as I say, whatever profit comes from it, it's going to one of the best causes I've ever come across in my life.